ask Professor Julie Cotter from the University of Southern Queensland, who very generously have sponsored our session today, to just say a few words about the University of Southern Queensland and what they're up to. So if you would please welcome Professor Julie Cotter, and we'll introduce our speaker.
Thanks, Mick, and thanks very much to the Farm Institute for this opportunity to sponsor the dinner. This is the second Australian Farm Institute conference that I've been to. I came last year as well on agricultural innovation in Australia, and actually, just talking to Mick, the AFI seems to really hit the strategic issues, and I think this is a big one. I'm really enjoying this conference, so thank you. A little bit about USQ. So a couple of things you might not know. One is USQ is based in Toowoomba on the Darling Downs, a prime agricultural region in Australia. And the other one is that we're pretty serious about agricultural research, and I think it's a bit of a hidden secret, so it's an opportunity to let you know about that tonight. We've recently been through a strategic focusing exercise at the university and discovered that 70% of our research was actually in agriculture. So we've got several research centres, including the National Centre for Engineering in Agriculture, and a few others working in that space. So fortunately the university has decided to build on that strength, invest $30 million in building our research, particularly in the agricultural space, and has formed the Institute of Agriculture and Environment in recognition of that strength and taking it forward. So far $15 million's been spent on increasing our capacity in agricultural research. Fortunately, I've been a recipient of some of that. I lead a research centre in sustainable business, and we've had 2 new postdoc research fellows in the agribusiness team as part of that funding, which has helped us build capacity. And the next tranche of funding is going into co-investment. So we're co-investing with industry and government in setting up research teams in particular areas of need in the agricultural space. So if I could just tell you a little bit about the agribusiness team that I co-lead. We do applied research, agribusiness research, working with industry. We've got a couple of joint projects with the Australian Farm Institute, I'm happy to say. We work a lot in the areas of farm management and farm financial management, so that's why I found this conference particularly interesting. Working on benchmarking, working with industry to help increase profitability of farm businesses particularly. Developing tools so that farmers can run what-if scenarios in terms of investment decision making. And I'm happy to say that we're also going to be the recipient of some of that co-investment very soon in terms of putting in a agricultural value chain research team of 3 people headed up by a professor in that space. So we've been fortunate to get co-investment. We're each putting in $300,000 a year, and we're setting up that team. Part of what they're doing is something else you might not know about Toowoomba, is there's an international airport being built in Toowoomba now, a private international airport, which probably sounds a little bit crazy, but one of the visions for that airport is to be flying out fresh agricultural produce from Australia to Asia overnight. And it's at the centre of a transport hub, so we're getting quite a bit of new infrastructure in terms of road and rail as well, and linking with the airport. So that will be the first priority for our ag value chain team to be working on that. So I think Toowoomba and USQ is an exciting place to be working in agriculture at the moment, so watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie. Our main speaker this evening is someone who has some pretty good knowledge of some of the issues around investment in agriculture in the USA. And so we heard this morning from speakers telling us about Brazil and New Zealand and what's happening in Asia. So to round that out, we've got some discussion now about what's happening in the USA and what sort of systems are in place there. That speaker is Greg Noonan, who's the head of markets agribusiness at the National Australia Bank. He joined the NAB group in 2007 after holding trading and treasury roles with Namoi Cotton, AWB Limited and Sugar Australia. In 2011, Greg was seconded to the NAB's US bank, Great Western Bank, to assist with the development and delivery of interest rate and commodity risk management products to the agribusiness sector there. So he relocated with his wife and 3 young children to Kansas City and spent 2 years there providing risk solutions to the bank's agribusiness and business clients. He returned to Australia in late 2013 and is now responsible for the delivery of similar products to NAB's agribusiness clients nationally. So to provide us with a perspective this evening of developments in US agriculture, please welcome Greg Noonan.
Thanks, Mick, and thank you for the opportunity to present tonight. NAB has enjoyed a long relationship with the Australian Farm Institute and looks forward to continued support of not only this forum, but the valuable research it conducts. Personally, thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of my experiences and observations from a period in my life that I'll always view fondly, both from a professional and personal perspective. It was a wonderful opportunity to spend a couple of years in the US, and I certainly enjoyed talking about it. Just a little bit more about me before I kick off. I grew up in Wee Waa in northern New South Wales, studied accountancy at Armidale at UNE, and then spent 5 years at Namoi Cotton, based in Wee Waa and also Toowoomba. Firstly in the cottonseed trading business and then as a lint and foreign exchange trader. Had a brief stint at AWB during what was a pretty interesting time for that organisation. On my second day in Melbourne, the oil for food scandal hit. So 7 months later, I was fortunate enough to land a role as a sugar and FX trader at CSR and Mackay's joint venture sugar refining business, Sugar Australia. In 2007, joined NAB. I had 4 years back in Toowoomba as an interest rate and commodity risk management dealer before embarking on the 2-year secondment to the US with Great Western Bank, based out of Kansas City. Returned in late 2013 to take on my current role, and I'm currently based in Brisbane. I'm married to Taryn. We have 3 children, Jock who's 7, May who's 5, Poppy who's 3, and a 12-week-old Great Dane called Moose, who may not make it to 13 weeks based on the current rate of destruction. And I'll also just issue a quick word of warning before I start. My form leading into tonight hasn't been great. I've had a fairly torrid day, as Mick alluded to, and I probably ordinarily wouldn't share this, but I kind of figured my wife got a good giggle out of it when I was recounting it in the cab on the way here, so I figured you could probably have a laugh at my expense as well. Unfortunately, I couldn't make it down any earlier than tonight. I had a clash with some leadership training that was going on in the NAB Brisbane office over 2 days, so the earliest I could escape was lunchtime today, and we had a follow-up function dinner last night, which was part of the program which I had to attend. So after paying the price of being out of the office all day yesterday, I decided I'd get in nice and early to the office this morning and clean up emails and those sorts of things. So I jumped in the cab at 5:30 and headed to work. And I actually normally ride my bike to work, which poses a whole range of logistical challenges for anyone who's tried to do that, particularly when you combine it with a lot of national travel. So getting your head around where your clothes are they in the locker at work, are they in your wardrobe at home, are they in the overnight bag that I left in the car, it really can become a logistical nightmare. So inevitably this morning I rocked in there with knowing that both of my black RMs were sitting in the locker at work, as they tend to find themselves from time to time. I had to pack them to bring with me. I had an unironed but clean shirt in there, which I knew I could throw in so that I could get out of my jeans and t-shirt from my day of training when I came down. And then I had to attend half of this training session. And so I got everything packed up, ready to go, and I walked into this training session, and look, I've got a bit of a conspiracy theory about facilitators. I know there's a lot of other people from banks here that have probably had similar experiences, but I'm pretty sure that conference facilitators have some sort of national forum like this where they sit around and try and come up with new ideas to embarrass large groups of people. And it actually reached a new high or low this morning for me, depending on which way you look at it, in that I turned up nice and early, explained that I had to leave for another commitment, and as I walked into the room, there was a professional face painter who was painting the faces of the 50 senior leaders that were gathered in this meeting. And look, I'm assuming it was obviously to disarm and make everyone equal and probably great. And I explained really kindly to her that I was unable to participate because I had to get on a plane in 3 hours and fly to Canberra to make a presentation. And she became quite militant and told me that at the 3 previous sessions she'd done, no one had escaped. And so I just had to say, look, the people at the Farm Institute are really friendly and easygoing, but I'm just not sure that turning up with a Mike Tyson sort of tattoo down the side of the face is really the look I'm after. So for 3 hours I had to dodge this lady, finally got out of there and made it to Brisbane Airport, where inevitably one tiny little cell of red and yellow on the radar came across and shut the place down. So despite my planning of 4 hours lead time from arrival at the airport to being here tonight, that then very quickly turned into basically no time at all. And so things started to go through my head. I'm still sitting there in my jeans and t-shirt thinking, how am I going to get dressed? I've got an unironed shirt in my bag. How am I going to manage this? I hadn't had a shave. So showered in there and thought I'm going to have to somehow iron a shirt. Luckily for me, the one men's retailer in Brisbane Airport has an incredible range of ultra slim fitting pastel paisley shirts. So went in, managed to fight my way to the back of the rack, found something that was respectable and remotely pressed, threw that on. Went to throw my boots on and realised that I'd actually managed to pick up one boot from either set of my 2 pairs of RMs. So I've got one 15-year-old RM with the nails sticking through the sole and another one which is quite comfortable, so it's a little bit unsettling. Anyway, made it here, landed at 6:15, got in a cab, and here I am. So despite the dramas, I did actually make it. So just a disclaimer, anything could happen tonight. No responsibility for any injuries caused by projector explosions, screen collapses, anything else associated with this presentation. Oh, great day. So tonight my presentation has 3 parts. Firstly, I'll give you an overview of the debt funding market in the US and some of the contrasts with our local system. I'll then talk a little bit about Great Western Bank, which is the wholly owned NAB subsidiary that I worked for 2 years in the US, and how credit assessment and debt structuring differs between Australia and the US. And finally, I'll share some of my personal and professional experiences from the Midwest USA. And I promise not to turn this into my own personal slide night with photos of my kids playing Little League Baseball and enjoying themselves at Disneyland, but there'll be some off-topic stuff at the end. So I might just jump to the first slide. I assume there we are. So firstly, let's begin with a look at the US farm debt market. It's approximately a $360 billion pie, split roughly 45% to 55% between commercial banks and the farm credit system. The commercial bank sector is highly fragmented and it's made up of literally thousands of deposit-taking institutions. The farm credit system is a government-sponsored enterprise comprising cooperative member associations that lend funds raised exclusively in wholesale markets. The farm credit system was created almost 100 years ago and was originally mandated to provide credit to small farms and new entrants to farming. It has grown in size so that if the entire network was a single bank, it would be the 9th largest bank in the US. The farm credit system is made up of approximately 80 retail associations or cooperatives that provide loans exclusively to members for the purposes of agricultural production, agribusiness and rural housing. The funds are distributed by 4 banks who raise capital via the issue of highly rated bonds and notes in the wholesale market. The farm credit system has the implied support of the US government, however the bonds are not specifically underwritten or guaranteed. Farm credit system banks and retail associations hold municipal, state and federal tax exemption, which in turn means any yield payable on the notes or bonds they issue is tax exempt for the investor. It's important to note the farm credit system can only provide loans, hence it's unable to take deposits and provide transactional banking services. And retail associations are overseen by a local board with profits returned to members via a rebate. So from a competitive standpoint, when we were working for Great Western Bank on term debt particularly, incredibly difficult to compete with, because effectively you've got an institution who is tax exempt, raising funds at a discounted rate in wholesale markets, who is then providing the additional incentive of rebates to those members who utilise their products. A quick overview of the commercial bank lending sector. Commercial banks provide an additional $160 billion of debt funding to US farms. Over 2,000 of the US's 7,000 odd commercial banks are considered specialist farm banks, which means more than 15% of their total loan book is to agriculture and agribusiness. Lending to agriculture has been a rare highlight in what has been a challenging 5 or 6 years for the US commercial banking system. Over that period of time, we've seen significant consolidation in terms of bank numbers and also lending volumes. As you can see from the chart on the left, total farm lending has increased sharply amongst farm banks in recent years against a backdrop of a declining number of participants. This is in stark contrast to commercial lending, and the consolidation of farm banks has occurred at a far slower pace than that of the broader commercial banking sector. And you'll also note that just over half of the loans made by farm banking are for production purposes, which compared with the farm credit system, it has a far higher percentage of its loans for term real estate. So you can see in the chart on the right, if we were to contrast that with farm credit, more of the farm credit lending is going for the purposes of ag real estate rather than overdrafts, machinery financing, etc. So just some of the interesting contrasts and observations of mine. Clearly the debt funding market is quite different to the market here in Australia. In many respects, working in the US debt market makes you feel a little bit like Michael J. Fox stepping out of his DeLorean 30 years ago into the past. Some of the difference I observed were the size of the market. Obviously, the Australian market is about 1/6 the size of the US debt market. There's a large number of borrowers with significantly smaller loans. So over 60% of US farm loans are less than $500,000. If you compare that with Australia, it's less than 25% in that $0 to $500,000 space. The US market's characterised by a large number of very small lenders. So very small banks. Medium Farm Bank has assets of $102 million. If I contrast that with our local situation here, an average size agribusiness portfolio is probably something in the order of $80 to $100 million, I'd guess. So your average bank size in the US is roughly the size of one agribusiness banker's portfolio at NAB. The fragmentation and the lack of scale means inefficiencies and underinvestment in technology. As I said, it really was a time warp, heavy reliance on checks, really slow adoption of the technologies that we see as very commonplace in financial systems here. A couple of the really interesting examples, I think the cost to income ratios of US farm banks versus the Australian majors. Cost to income simply a measure of bank operating costs against total revenue. 46% amongst the big four here in Australia, contrasting with 67% for US farm banks. And as a result, given that higher cost base, unsurprisingly, substantially higher lending margins on farm loans. So net interest margin on farm loans in the US averaging about 3.75%, as opposed to the big fours published margins of about 2.1. So despite the fact there's significant competition, obviously, with well over 2,000 specialist farm banks, certainly significantly higher net interest margins. Focusing on the Great Western Bank. Great Western Bank was purchased by NAB in 2007, and since then it's roughly tripled in size to $6 billion in loans through a combination of acquisition and quite aggressive loan growth. 25% of the loans are to agriculture. It's the 8th largest commercial lender to agriculture in the US, with $1.6 billion in loans, and the 4th largest farm bank based on that criteria of greater than 15% of total loans to the agricultural sector. Looking at the Great Western Bank footprint, the footprint spans the central and northern Midwest Corn Belt, includes Colorado and Arizona. There's about 180 branches across 7 states with 1,500 employees. A little over half of the branches have been acquired since NAB's purchase in 2007. So based on that graphic you can see there, the blue dots are the branches from the original acquisition in 2007, and the red dots are the branches through acquisition in 2009, 2010. So the timing was quite fortuitous from a NAB perspective, given that there was a lot of distressed banks during 2008, 2009, and the FDIC, the regulator over there, was actively encouraging well-capitalised banks to take on some of these more distressed players, which was advantageous for us. It allowed us to rapidly expand during that period. Strategically, the footprint covers some of the most productive agricultural regions of the US, and future expansion plans are focused on growth in these regions. So you can see across states like South Dakota, Iowa, accounting for a significant portion of agricultural production, and expansion plans are really focused around states like Minnesota, North Dakota, Illinois and Wisconsin. GWB has customers in the dryland corn and bean cropping, intensive livestock production and dairy, grazing, irrigated cotton and horticulture industries. It also banks a growing number of mid-tier independent grain elevators. GWB is fully self-funded by deposits and has no reliance on wholesale funding, which is typical of most of that size of bank and smaller bank in the US. I'll now drill down into some of my observations of the specific differences between doing business with farmers in the US with GWB and Australian farmers with NAB. Probably one of the most obvious ones that I observed is the amount of leasing that goes on in the US, particularly in that corn and beans area. There's a deep and very liquid market for leased farmland, and it's quite uncommon to have a customer in corn and bean production that actually owns 100% of the land they farm. The typical ratio that we would see is in the order of 50% of the ground owned and 50% of the ground leased. Farmers see themselves as having 3 distinct funding requirements, and those are one for crop and seasonal, another for machinery and another for real estate. And quite commonly, given farm credit's distinct advantage from a price perspective, we'd see clients who'd have their ag real estate debt with farm credit, which was the cheapest source of long-term funding. They then would have asset finance, perhaps with a John Deere, and then they may have a seasonal line with someone like Great Western Bank, who'd also provide them with transactional services. So a lot of split banking, and really viewed as clients as 3 specific needs rather than the bundling that we tend to see here in the Australian market. I won't talk extensively about crop insurance. I know it's on the agenda for tomorrow, but it does have a significant impact on the way we did business in the US. The really, I suppose, powerful one for me was just our appetite around loan-to-value ratios. So, we'd see situations where we'd have new entrants into farm ownership who'd be geared anywhere to 65 or 70% loan-to-value ratios on dryland cropping, purely because the business is underpinned by multi-peril crop insurance, which essentially, provides a really safe backstop in the event of, production or price failure. The other thing it means is that term debt is fully amortising. I didn't see a single interest-only farming deal in my 2 years there. Every piece of term real estate debt that we issued was principal and interest to nil, with structured amortisations over 25 years. So, that'd be a bit of a shock, I think, to most of the Australian farming community. A couple of the other things that it did add is obviously some certainty around risk management, and having an underpinning crop insurance policy meant that farmers were far more willing to hedge aggressively, knowing that they had a backstop of crop insurance. And I'll tell you a story about a really clever use of crop insurance in a minute. Risk aversion. US farmers typically highly risk averse. The discussions that I was having in the interest rate market was around how long can you fix me for. We had farmers wanting to do 30 years fixed if we'd let them. We had a policy that didn't see us go beyond 15, but effectively, if there was a market to hedge interest rates, they would take as much term as you could possibly give them, regardless of the relative value of the curve. And surprisingly to me, when I was there, we had a situation where variable rates were at obviously record lows. Fed funds at 0 to 0.25, and we actually saw quite a sharp steepening in the US yield curve, to the point where the differential between a 10 or 15-year fixed rate and a floating rate was out to 2.5%, 3%. And I really started to question the value, particularly on amortising debt, around taking such a long-term hedge and fixing yourself in at those levels, particularly given the outlook for US interest rates at that stage was that floating rates were going to stay low for an extended period. Yet it wasn't a conversation issue from a client point of view. It was a case of, look, if you can fix me for 10 or 15 at 6-ish, then I'm in. So yeah, really risk averse and quite simplistic in their outlook when it came to interest rate risk management. If only it was so easy here. The other observation I'd make is that there's a far broader range of risk management tools, particularly for livestock producers. So some of our more canny livestock producers, particularly in the dairy and the hog industries, were effectively at a point where they were just managing margin. They were able to hedge all of their output risk, they were able to hedge all of their input risk, and they could effectively ensure margin for anywhere up to 2 years in advance, which certainly on the output side here in the cropping space, we've got some good tools, but we really lack sophistication when it comes to what we can do in livestock areas. So that was another distinct difference between doing business with US farmers and Australian farmers. Look, I'll just talk you through a crop insurance story before I go on to talking about Iowa. I had a client based in Sioux City, Iowa, which is on the Iowa-Nebraska border, up the northern end, approaching the South Dakota border. These guys were quite large scale. They were farming about 8,000 acres of reasonable country. It wasn't the best country. If you went 50 miles to the east and got off the floodplain of the Missouri River, then you were talking the prime northwestern Iowa country, which fetches $20,000 an acre for dry land. This stuff was on the floodplain. It had quite a high water table, and they suffered from waterlogging early in the season. So their yields were more like the 175 to 180 bushels an acre rather than the 220, 230 that you could get within 50 miles of there. These guys were good farmers. They were quite fortuitous in that they had a couple of large dairies located within 15 miles of where they were. So their summer cropping program was largely around growing 8,000 acres of corn, 4,000 acres of which was cut for silage for the dairy, and the other 4,000 acres which was grown for grain to be harvested. And 2012, which as everyone would be aware, was a particularly tough year in the US. The worst drought since the Dust Bowl, which translates to no rain for 6 weeks in the US. And obviously we had explosive commodity markets. We saw the corn price rally to unprecedented levels. So these guys got their silage in, their corn for silage in nice and early, the 4,000 acres. Idea being they wanted to cut it hopefully in the July period. And the way they priced their silage was that it was a function of the corn price. So ultimately the dairy had to pay them whatever return they could get out of actually growing it as corn for grain. So there was a formula to pay them based on the prevailing corn price. The other 4,000 of acres for grain got held up. It went in a little bit later. Anyway, we did budgets based on $5.50 a bushel for the price of corn, and their 5-year average yield was 175 bushels an acre. So we were basically budgeting on $965 an acre in revenue if everything played out okay. These guys had done about 50% of their grain hedging as well, so they'd sold about 2,000 acres worth of corn at $5.50 a bushel. They took out a crop insurance policy to protect them for 85% of their 5-year yield at a cost of about $40 an acre. The 4,000 acres of silage was cut as planned. Very fortunate in that obviously things had deteriorated. The corn price had started to lift. They cut this silage, sold it at the spot price to the two dairies for the highest price they'd ever sold it for. I think it was in the low $7 a bushel by late July. took a look at how the 4,000 acres for grain was going, and it was in a bit later, and it was really struggling. So in early August, it was still looking green, but it had been so stressed during tasseling that the grain production was going to be abysmal. Called in the insurance assessor in early August to have a look at the crop, and he actually declared it an entire write-off, which was quite rare. He said, look, this thing's shot to pieces. So the minute the insurance assessor rolled off the farm, out came the silage cutter. In they went, cut the whole thing for silage. Admittedly, it didn't yield as well as they would have liked, but sold the silage to the dairy, now at $8 a bushel. And then banked an insurance cheque for 85% of 4,000 acres at the prevailing October price, which by that stage was in the low 8s a bushel. So all told, we got to the end of the year in the worst drought ever, and we'd grossed about $1,300 an acre versus $965, taking into account hedge losses of 250 cents a bushel on 2,000 acres worth of corn, and these guys had the best year they had ever had. A little bit about Iowa. Iowa's an amazing state. It was one of the states that I spent a lot of time in. We have a big chunk of our client base there, and it really astounded me, how productive the land is. So it's roughly twice the size of Tasmania. 90% of it is farmland. The average farm size is 330 acres. They're the largest producer of corn and soybeans in the US. The farm gate value of ag production in Iowa is about $15 billion, which is roughly the same as New South Wales and Queensland combined for all agricultural products. They have annual average participation of about 43 inches, plus snow on top of that. Most of Iowa would probably receive something in the order of 50 to 60 inches of snow a year, which from a rainfall perspective, the equivalent's about 10%. The good corn land's worth about 10 to 13,000 an acre for dry land and can reach 20. And the average yield's about 4.5 tonne to the acre, sort of high 100s a bushel. 25% of US ethanol is produced there, unsurprisingly, given that they're also the biggest producer of corn, and 28% of US pork is also produced there. So look, I'll wrap up with some personal observations and experiences, and as I explained, I probably will go a little bit off topic here. Look, one of the first ones is obviously that everything's cheap in the US, and I think fuel at 80 cents a litre, it's really interesting talking to locals. They think they've had their throats cut because it's not 40. Anything with an engine in it is roughly half the price of what you'd expect to pay here in Australia. My old man came over to visit at one stage, and he was trying to get his head around how he could get a 40-foot container of these back to Australia as we walked into Home Depot, which is the equivalent of Bunnings. So these sit lined up out the front at $1,700 a machine versus the $3,300 that your local friendly John Deere dealer will charge you locally. Look, one of the other things that struck me is that quite often you tend to forget where you are. You're driving through the Iowa countryside, and anyone who's spent any time in that part of the world knows that it's pretty mind-numbing in terms of just monotony of corn and beans. But I was driving to this town one day, and there's a few people in this room who probably know the scene. Anyone who's been to Gurley in northern New South Wales, this was actually the middle of Iowa, and as I drove in, I just couldn't believe that there was a Shell service station on the left and the silos on the right, and if it wasn't for the fact I was driving on the wrong side of the road, I could have been back in Gurley. Look, the weather's pretty brutal. Everyone would be well aware of that. The snow is quite debilitating, particularly in cities like Kansas City, where you tend not to get regular snow, and they're just not as well set up for clearing as they are in places like Chicago or Minneapolis. So the second winter we were there, we had about 42 inches of snow for the year, including 3 falls in excess of 8 inches, and the place just shuts down. Schools close for 3 days. It takes them an eternity to get the streets cleared. I was the only bloke in the street with a smile on his face as he was shoveling his driveway because of the novelty, and my wife's out there taking photos. That's a shot of our backyard after an 8-inch fall. You can probably make out the kids' trampoline in the middle there, and that's an outdoor entertaining area. So on a lot of days like that, I unfortunately had to work from home, which isn't all bad. And look, just one of the other experiences I'll share with you, when I was over there, I took a bit of a liking to Kansas City barbecue. Kansas City's quite famous for its smoked meats, its ribs, its brisket, its pulled pork. I actually brought back a big green egg, which is a terracotta smoking device, which I plague my neighbourhood in Brisbane with fumes of hickory every Sunday. But to counteract, obviously, the large amount of very fatty meat that I was eating, I had to find some sort of offset. So I got quite serious about jogging when I was over there, and I ran the Chicago and the Cleveland marathons. And running in the US is enormous. It really floored me. Even locally in Kansas City, you'd turn up to a 5K fun run and there'd be 3,000 or 4,000 people there. You know, a lot of incredibly fit people, despite the fact that obviously the US has got problems with its obesity rates. And there was one guy that stood out in the races that I did, and I was doing a half marathon in Kansas City in preparation for the Chicago marathon, and I needed to run a qualifying time to get a spot in a starting corral at Chicago. So there's 45,000 people in the Chicago marathon. You really don't want to be at the back of the pack with the walkers because it's a battle to get through. So I thought I'll do a half, I'll submit a time, and I'll get in a starting corral. So I trained really hard, and I was actually down to the point where I was running about 1 hour 30 half marathons, and I was pretty happy with that because I'd sort of cut about 20 minutes off my time, and I got over the finish line, struggling to get my breath back and feeling quite proud of myself, and I spotted a guy in the crowd who'd actually run 1 hour 24, so 6 minutes better than me. The difference was he actually did it carrying an oak cross. So this guy's name's Ryan, and he runs for a team called Crazy for God, and he did an entire 21k half marathon in 1 hour 24 carrying a solid oak wooden cross. It was pretty impressive. Look, that brings to a close my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks very much, Greg. I think you struck the right note for an after-dinner entertainment speaker, while at the same time providing some very interesting information about the US farm finance scene. And I'm starting to come to the conclusion after Marcelo's discussion and Greg's that farmers in Australia and New Zealand are the only ones that operate under normal bank financing arrangements. Everyone else seems to get a leg up, but maybe that's the wrong impression. I'm sure there may be some questions anywhere. We've got one. Duncan, where's the microphone? Kylie, Duncan Bremer.
I'm not a financier. I have struggled to balance my savings account, and I'm still trying to get used to Crazy for God there. Look, Jesus Christ, what? Sorry, and that was an unintentional pun. I recently met a Georgian sugarcane grower who had gone broke, and I guess my question goes to how influential is the lobbies over there? Because over here we sweeten everything with sugarcane. Over there, and having recently driven from New York to Washington with a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old boy in the back who'd just eaten a whole lot of corn syrup without me knowing, I discovered the impact of corn syrup. How distorted is the market in that regard? And could it be a situation where corn is the be-all and end-all in the US, but is there a comparison with Australia in regards to corn syrup versus sugar, and how artificial are the market demands?
Yeah, so I'll answer that question in two parts, just around the lobby piece. I mean, obviously it gets quite a bit of publicity, but the farm lobby is incredibly powerful in the US. I mean, the one I keep coming back to is, I think over 5 years, the tax losses that the US taxpayer is incurring by allowing the farm credit system to retain its tax exemption status is about $6.5 billion. The cost to the American taxpayer of crop insurance subsidies, the grower's paying $40 an acre. of the subsidy, you've got the local county, the state, and the federal government kicking in a third each. You know, there's multiple billions of dollars tied up in crop insurance subsidies as well. We've got a democratic government in power in the worst fiscal situation in US history, yet none of this is being repealed. So I think that answers the question about the power of lobbies in the US, and particularly the farm lobby. And you've only got to look at a state like Iowa, which is a swinging state at a Republican primary level, and then in a full Congress election, and 90% of the state is farmland. So, very, very powerful. Look, there's no doubt that the corn industry has done a really good job of creating incredible demand for its own product. Whether it be subsidised ethanol production, or whether it be the fact that corn syrup is in absolutely everything. You can't buy a loaf of bread without it having a corn syrup taste to it. We had to buy a bread maker when we lived there because we just couldn't eat the bread. So, look, totally entrenched in everything they do.
Greg, Ben Russell from Rabo. I really enjoyed your talk, and I've spent a little bit of time in the Midwest. Rabo's got a bank over there, and my ex-boss, Neil Dobbin, went from Rabo Australia to Rabobank in the US, and I'm sure he's got a lot of interesting stories like your own, but one of the ones that he told me was one of the big triumphs of his first sort of year or 18 months with the bank over there was getting the bankers to dispose of having guns in the cars. So it was sort of, trying to get them, firstly trying to talk them out of having, the huge, big cars, but then also getting them to get rid of their guns was a really big thing. And he reckons he's succeeded. I'm not sure he has, but the NAB bankers in the US carry guns. Because it can be. I'm not sure how it works with the clients, but I suspect that they probably out-armour you as a banker.
Significantly, yeah. Look, it's quite intimidating sitting at a kitchen table at a farm somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and next to the kitchen table are 3 Smith & Wesson safes, which are full of basically an arsenal sitting behind you. Yeah, so they do have safes. They don't actually lock them, but yeah. Look, I must admit, I didn't go down the gun path when I was there, but I did go down the big car path and bought a Dodge Durango with a 5.7 litre Hemi in it, and it was really good in straight lines, but not so good on corners, which on US interstates is okay. But I figured, at 80 cents a litre, if I'm ever going to own one of these, now's the time. So I must admit, I did indulge a little bit while I was there. But look, the gun thing's an interesting one. It's culturally, it's so different to what we're used to. I must admit, it's a little bit off-putting, walking your 6-year-old to school and walking through the front door and seeing the big no gun sign on the front, and to be honest, having a kid in public kindergarten during the period when Sandy Hook was unfolding was pretty unnerving. In the 2 years that we were there, that was really the only point in time where we sort of sat back and said, should we just go home? But yeah, look, it's very different.
Mick, can you indulge me tonight because we're in Canberra? But could I ask the professor a question? And thank you, Greg. It was a fantastic speech. On notice, I read the papers and I'm trying to keep up with the latest budget implications on education fees, etc. But I also think I read that Mr. Pine was anti-research. And I'm just curious as to your take on the budget implications and what it means both from an agricultural sourcing of competent people to go into agriculture, but also from your point of view, what does the budget mean to you in your university?
We'll let Julie answer that if she may, or you can pass if you like.
No,
People think of more questions than Greg.
That's right. I will give a quick answer while people are thinking of more questions. Yeah, I think it's going to be mixed across Australian universities. Christopher Pine's talking mainly from the education rather than the research point of view. And I think we will see some big fee rises, particularly with the group of 8 universities. Regional universities like USQ, I don't think we'll see such big rises. But in terms of research, anti-research, I'm not sure, but definitely there's a big bent towards medical research as opposed to other research. Very happy to see that the agricultural RDCs have not had a funding cut as part of the budget, which we were all a bit frightened that they would. And I guess the other thing is a $2,000 co-payment by PhD students. We have a lot of trouble getting Australian PhD students as it is that need to give up highly paid jobs to come and do their PhDs. So I'm a little bit worried about what that means for the future of agricultural research in Australia. Thanks.
Thank you, Darren Arney from South Australia. Just with the price protection program in the US, do you find farmers or traders actually participating or competing or taking advantage of that price protection and buying call options or Texas hedging or leveraging themselves more forward sold than what South Australian farmers would be doing?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and it does obviously vary from client to client, but I suppose, where crop insurance has gone into the US, effectively now a lot of the policies have an embedded put option in them. So, it's not only peril but price that can trigger an insurance payout. So that's changing the marketing attitudes a little bit. I saw that in the sort of latter parts of my time there. But even so, I mean, even without a true put embedded in the crop insurance, the way the payout is determined is it's the higher of the average price at planting or the higher and price at harvest. So in that 2012 year, it's $5.50 a bushel at planting. It was $8 average in October, so the payout price was based on the $8, which was higher. So there's almost an element of optionality built into a standard crop insurance program. Look, to be honest, Darren, it wasn't dissimilar to what I see here. We had some people who I'd probably classify as frequent and aggressive participants in the market, and similarly we also have people who are more active locally. I didn't see huge amounts of over-hedging. I saw some people get themselves into a mess, I suppose, with more exotic products, and particularly ones that were embedded in physical grain contracts. So we had quite a number of clients who were still disputing with the large grain players in the US over accumulator contracts and things that were based on physical delivery. But yeah, look, it certainly wasn't any worse than what I see here.
Yeah, Graham Jennings. Thanks, Greg, for a great presentation. Quite a few years since I was in the US, but it sort of played out, and I wanted to check if this is still the case, that they're not really good at succession planning. Sort of dad falls off the perch, so there's some tax implications around that.
Yep.
Maybe you could elaborate on that a little. So they put mum in a nursing home because she can't run the farm. And then the siblings who are now operating as bond traders in New York or psychologists in San Francisco would much rather hold on to the property than pay taxes and lease the property out. And they get a 4 or 5% return on the lease. So hence, with 2 million farmers and about half the properties leased, you've got about 1 million farmers that are leasing properties at least.
Yep.
And a very, very deep leasing market.
Yep.
But behind all that is that tax. There's a tax issue.
Correct. Yeah, look, you're absolutely right. And the stereotypical little old lady who lives in the local country town 10 miles away that owns a square mile is absolutely correct. The picture you painted, Graham, is spot on. And that was something that really astounded me is how deep agricultural land ownership is within the US population, and people you really don't expect to have an exposure to land prices in central Iowa. Owning country, you're absolutely spot on, and part of that is an estate planning issue and around family transfer upon death. So they'll retain it in the family as long as possible and multi-generationally. It'll pass down to nieces and nephews who'll retain it. A lot of the bankers that we worked with, which when you look at the values of some of these properties and you look at a bank manager's wage, it wasn't particularly congruent in terms of the fact that these guys were owning thousands of acres of agricultural prime corn growing land, but were also still, you know, rolling out in the car every day and doing their job as a bank manager, and very well. But you know, that astounded me that a lot of my colleagues there had, you know, family land that they'd lease out.
Greg, Luke Chandler from Rabobank. Interested in your thoughts on the impact of the shale gas revolution in the US and how that's sort of transforming the US economy, but also, I guess, the impact on the agricultural sector and potential implications of knock-on effects of, say, to US corn ethanol. I know a couple of years ago I did a spring wheat tour through North Dakota, and it was we couldn't get a hotel room in North Dakota. We had to drive up to Canada to actually get a room. I mean, it seems to be massive over there. Just interested in your thoughts from the ground there.
Yeah, look, I'm not overly close to it, Luke, to be honest with you, from I guess an economic standpoint. But the observation I would make is around that North Dakota phenomenon, and then also, you know, Wyoming, Colorado, and the activity that we'd see around there, and the stories around North Dakota are just mind-blowing. You know, people who are, again, it comes back to, you know, one of the major succession issues that particularly South Dakota farmers are facing was that the money that's on offer in the mining camps in North Dakota is so attractive that people are going up there and you know, operating, you know, basically trailer parks to make $1 out of, you know, all of this you know, accommodation requirement that just keeps booming in that part of the world. So yeah, look, in terms of ethanol, to be honest, I'm probably not close enough to make an educated comment, but yeah, absolutely observe that as well.